Napoleon Bonaparte was not 5'2", that number is real, but the myth is the ruler. His recorded 5'2" used Old French inches, which were longer than English inches. Converted into modern terms, Napoleon stood closer to 5'6" or 5'7" normal, even slightly above average, for a Frenchman of his era. You've been lied to about what this man looked like, and the lie survived because it was simple, funny, and useful. By the end, you'll know the real Napoleon, not the tiny cartoon goblin, not the marble superhero, but a pale, intense, grey-eyed man whose face became one of the most weaponized images in history. His enemies shrank him into a joke. His own artists turned him into destiny. The real man stood somewhere between those two inventions, and that is where the story gets interesting. Before Napoleon became an emperor, before the hand-in-coat pose, before the hat became a logo, he was a 27-year-old general in Italy. Lean, pale, hungry-looking. Antoine-Jean painted him in 1796 in Bonaparte at Arcole. Long chestnut-brown hair, a sharp face, restless energy, and eyes that seemed to be looking past the battlefield into the future. This was not the round emperor of later portraits. This was the young predator. Most people carry two Napoleons in their heads. The first is the joke. Short, angry, overcompensating. One hand in the coat, one massive hat doing half the work. The second is the statue. Jaw like a Roman coin, cloak whipping in the Alps, horse rearing like Europe itself is terrified. Both are propaganda. British cartoonists shrank him into little Boney, while Napoleon's own artists stretched him into destiny. Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps, painted from 1801 onward, shows him calm on a fiery horse, pointing toward greatness like history has already surrendered. But the real Alpine crossing was much less cinematic. No rearing stallion, no perfect cloak, no divine wind machine. Historians generally agree Napoleon crossed in practical campaign conditions, most likely on a mule or similar mount, wrapped against the cold, moving through snow and rock, with an army that cared more about logistics than legend. So what did Napoleon actually look like when the paint comes off? Start with height, because this is the myth that refuses to die. Napoleon's physician Francesco Antomarchi recorded him after death at about 5 French feet 2 inches. His doctor Corvisart described him in 1802 as 5 feet 2 inches by French measure, equivalent to about 5 feet 6 in English measure. The old French inch, the pouce, was longer than the English inch, so 5'2" did not mean modern 5'2". It meant roughly 5'6", maybe 5'7", depending on the conversion and source. The nickname made the myth worse. His soldiers called him le petit caporal, the little corporal. But this was not originally an insult, it was affectionate. Napoleon was young. He lived close to his troops. He knew artillery. He understood camp life. In the Italian campaigns, soldiers saw him as one of them and above them at the same time. Little corporal did not mean, look at this tiny man. It meant, that's our general. Now the hair. In movies and cheap illustrations, Napoleon often gets black hair, dark, harsh, almost villainous. Contemporary descriptions are more complicated. Alexander von Humboldt saw him in 1798 and described brown hair. Corvisart called it very fine chestnut hair. Constant, Napoleon's valet, remembered it as fine, soft, and rich brown. His eyes were also lighter than many people imagine. Corvisart described them as grey, penetrating and mobile. Mary Berry called them light grey. Joseph Farrington thought they were blue-grey. The safest answer is this: chestnut-brown hair and grey-blue eyes. Those eyes mattered. Again and again, people who expected a monster found something stranger. A man who did not physically overwhelm a room until he looked at you. Hyde de Neuville, a royalist conspirator, said Napoleon first seemed unimpressive. Then Napoleon raised his head and fixed him with such a penetrating glance that Neuville felt he had grown taller. That was the real physical power. Not height. Focus. Now assemble the face. Corvisart described a man with a large head, high broad forehead, pale smooth skin, broad shoulders, short neck, and a chin that projected slightly. Humboldt saw an oval, spare face, strong mouth, strong round chin, curved but not hooked nose, deep-set eyes, and facial muscles that moved intensely when he spoke. This was not a delicate face. It was not the face of a romantic poet. It was a command face, a face built around pressure. Then age changed him. The Arcole Napoleon of 1796 is lean, nervous, almost hungry. By the consulate he had filled out. By the empire he was broader, heavier, and more settled into the body people now associate with him. The face rounded. The neck seemed shorter. The body became stockier. This was not just weight gain, it was lifestyle, power, stress, constant work, rich food, irregular sleep, and years of campaigns grinding through the body. David's 1812 Napoleon in his study gives us a different man from Arcole, not the windblown young general, not the Alpine demigod, an emperor at work. The painting shows the controlled image Napoleon wanted, tireless, disciplined, surrounded by papers, still awake while the empire sleeps. But look closer. The hair is messier. The face is fuller. There are bags beneath the eyes. The hairline has receded. The body has thickened. This is propaganda too, but it leaks truth. After Waterloo, witnesses became less generous. Paul de Kock called Napoleon yellow, obese, and bloated. Captain Ross, aboard HMS Northumberland, described him as fat and pot-bellied, with a sallow complexion and light grey eyes. Sir George Bingham called him corpulent, short-necked, and not visually extraordinary. That last phrase matters. Not visually extraordinary. By 1815, the great conqueror did not look like a thunderbolt. He looked like a tired, heavy man in a dark coat. But the eyes were still there. At Saint Helena, illness and captivity finished the transformation. Napoleon died in 1821 at 51. His autopsy found severe stomach disease. Modern medical discussion still debates some details, but stomach cancer, or a cancerous gastric ulcer, remains the dominant explanation. Arsenic poisoning theories exist, but they remain contested. This final Napoleon was heavier, puffier, paler, and more exhausted. Yet even in decline, accounts still return to the same detail. The eyes, tired now, but not empty. And then comes the death mask. It is tempting to treat it as the final answer, because plaster does not flatter. But even the mask has problems. The casting history is tangled between Antoine-Jean and British surgeon Francis Burton. Some accounts place the key cast after the autopsy, when decomposition had already begun in the heat. Later copies multiplied. Historians still argue over which mask preserves the closest original impression. So the death mask tells us something real. The broad, heavy, settled face of a sick man at the end. It does not tell us what the young general looked like at Arcole. Put it all together. Napoleon was probably around 5'6" or 5'7" in modern height. He began as a gaunt, pale, sharp-featured young artillery officer with chestnut-brown hair, light grey-blue eyes, and a face that looked more thoughtful than theatrical. He grew into a broad-shouldered, short-necked, increasingly stocky ruler, with a large head, smooth pale complexion, thinning brown hair, a strong chin, and a gaze people remembered long after they forgot the exact shape of his nose. He was not the tiny goblin of British cartoons. He was more useful than that. Napoleon's body became part of his leadership system. The plain grey coat said, "I work." The small hat said, "You can recognize me through smoke." The hand in the waistcoat said, "Control." The calm face said, "I have already calculated what you fear." David turned him into a heroic statesman. Gross turned him into the savior general. British artists turned him into a tantrum with boots. The real Napoleon lived between those images. So next time someone says Napoleon was short, remember, the most famous thing about his body is mostly a measurement error wrapped in enemy propaganda. Napoleon understood that power has a face. And if you do not design that face yourself, your enemies will draw it for you.